to week 2 of our course on international relations. This week we're starting our first topic, our first module. If you remember from our conversation last week, we will be going through a series of modules here, and this is the lecture, or at least it's part 1 of our first lecture that's going to be online. The module 2 then, or week 2 topic is what we call realism. And the first thing you need to know about realism really is that it's sort of the oldest and most venerable theory of international relations. It also tends to have a reputation as the most cynical international relations theory, often taking a very dim view of why human beings tend to go to war. And that's, I suppose, understandable to a certain extent, given that history seems to show that human beings are uniquely ill-suited to resolving their disputes peacefully. But it's very frustrating for many people because they seem to think that realists have no sense of progress, that everything stays the same, human nature being what it is. We're always condemned to be at war with each other. And, some people want to argue that human beings can improve themselves, and historically speaking have proven that they can improve themselves over time through various philosophies of enlightenment, and can overcome their human nature. So we'll get into those theories later in the course, but for now anyway, we just have this theory, realism, that we're looking at. We're suggesting that this is the theory that's at the very core of international relations theory. And so my goal today really is just to talk you through some of the core issues and concerns. So here we see by the end of this lecture, you should be able to do the following things. You should be able to state what the 3 essential tenets of realism are, and this is really what you should be focusing actually your journals on for this week. State what the 3 essential tenets of realism are. Explain what the timeless wisdom of realism is. That's when we say that realism is the oldest theory. One of the things that realism has going for it is that it has this timeless wisdom that it seems to keep referring back to. That things have always been this way, and because they've always been this way, they probably will always be this way. So we also want to explain the difference, or know the difference, between realism and neorealism. That's an important goal for us. You'll see why as we go through the lecture today. And you also want to understand why neorealism is so popular today. And then finally, we will criticize realism. We will investigate whether realism can be criticized. But in order to be able to do that, we will need to first have watched our movie, which is The Lord of the Flies, and we'll be watching that in class for day 2 of this module. So, what is realism about? Well, its key question really is this question posed here on the screen, and I'm getting this from the Cynthia Weber book because she prints it there as well, is what causes wars to happen? Where do wars come from? Why? What generates them? What stimulates them or catalyzes them? What causes wars to happen? Realism has very specific theories about that, and we need to state the 3 essential tenets of realism before we can understand why that's so. So what are the 3 essential tenets of realism? Realism makes 3 assumptions before it starts analyzing the world. It makes the assumption of statism, the assumption of survival, or survivalism if you will, and the assumption of self-help, which we explain through the model of the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the gentleman in the photograph here is Henry Kissinger, and he's an exemplary realist. And we will talk about him and others like him in the course of this lecture. But let's talk briefly about statism, survival, and self-help, or the 3 S's as they're known. I'm going to go through these in detail in just a moment, but just very, very briefly to encapsulate them. Statism is the assumption that human beings tend to come together in groups. One type of group is different to the other types of groups. It is the nation state. It is important, and we'll get into this on this slide in a minute, to understand that the state is not just like a Boy Scout group, or not like a church, not like a corporation, and not even like a terrorist group, that the state is a specific type of group that has specific types of powers. And we need to be very careful that we understand what that is. What does this special type of group called the state want to do? It wants to survive, it wants to live in order to be able to achieve its goals, moral goals, aesthetic goals. So how's it going to do that? Well, we need to give consideration to the fact that there is this thing called anarchy. Nation states interact with each other under conditions of anarchy, and so we need to be able to understand that states are aware of this, and because they're aware of anarchy, they will engage in self-help behavior. So those are the 3 S's, and we're going to explain each one in more detail now. Statism. The gentleman in the photograph is Max Weber, famous sociologist, and he gave us some language which is very, very helpful for us in trying to understand the nation state and where it's coming from and where it's going to. So what is statism? Statism is the assumption that the state is the most important actor. As we were saying just a moment ago, that the nation state is a different actor to other types of groupings of human beings, and we will want to be able to specify that unique difference that the state has. Let me turn on the light here just in case it's getting dark. So we know that human beings have always come together in groups. They tend to come together in groups, tribes, city-states, empires, nation-states. That's fair to say. These tribes, city-states, empires, nation-states are usually bound together by something that makes them state-like, right? All of these, we're arguing, are in a way state-ish actors. And why would we say that? Why would we call a tribe or a city-state an empire or nation-state? Why would we lump them all together and say that they're sort of the same thing, when in fact they often have quite dramatic differences between them? Well, namely because they're sovereign. They have sovereign power. And to understand sovereignty, which is the magic thing that makes the state what it is, compared to, say, a Boy Scout group or a church group, it's Max Weber said it very well in his classic definition, which is famous. He said that the sovereign is the power that successfully claims for itself the monopoly of legitimate physical force within a given territory. Now, there's elements of that definition to be broken down and thought about. A sovereign is a power. We don't know what type of power, but it is a power that claims for itself the monopoly, which means that it should be the sole power. If you talk about a monopolar force, it means all the power is at one pole. So a monopolar power. So the sovereign is the power that claims the monopoly of legitimate, that's another word we have to think about, which means justified, I suppose, physical force within a given territory. So what is legitimate physical force? Well, if we think about it, we don't have to think too hard. I think most of us are capable of understanding that even in our country here right now, there are people who have legitimate force and people who have illegitimate force. The people of illegitimate force tend to be thought of as robbers, criminals, terrorists, subversives of some sort. Whereas those who have legitimate physical force tend to be on the side of the police and the army, right? They're the official force of the nation state that is in question. So whether it be Canada or Ireland or Australia, the government typically is that power. But in other countries, of course, there's dictatorship. And this is an important point because the definition that Max Weber is putting forward here is actually very thin. When we see the word legitimate, we tend to think of, maybe something that's been approved of through the mass political participation of a group of voters, for example, who would express their endorsement of that force, therefore legitimizing it. Well, Weber is suggesting, in so many words, that that's not necessarily the case. You could have legitimate physical force, and indeed you do, in a dictatorship. And you might say, well, that's not true. A dictatorship is illegitimate. Well, to you and I, maybe. But the reality is, For Weber, the measurement of legitimacy is not really to do with whether we like it or not. It's to do with whether or not there's a state of revolution in that country or not. So revolution is the key determining indicator of whether there is legitimacy or not, right? So think about the American Civil War. The sovereignty of the northern forces, the Union, was challenged by the South, and thereby breaking apart or breaking in two the previously existing legitimacy of the federal United States. And that was obviously a very long-running war, which led to a struggle and a lot of death, carnage in the country. Similarly, other countries like Ireland, where I'm from, have had civil wars where sovereignty is challenged, contested. So long as no one's challenging the sovereignty of a country, it is said to be legitimate, because it is functioning. And that's really the key thing you need to think about when it comes to Max Weber's definition, is the fact that he was a functionalist, really, when it comes down to it. He was more interested in whether things were functioning or not. So it doesn't matter if people like it or not. The reality is it was functioning, and therefore sovereignty was present, and that's how he measures it. So if Max Weber's giving us that definition of the state, and we now know that the state is different to other types of actors compared to Boy Scout groups or church clubs and societies, that kind of thing, that the state is something that has the monopoly over the legitimate physical force, then we still have the two other S's to contend with, which are survival and, of course, coming up in a minute, self-help. So survival. Nation states have a population, and the population are the government, the dictator, what have you. They have goals, right? Whoever is expressing the views for the nation state, that person will have a set of goals, or that group of people will have a set of goals, and they are sensitive to the need to see those goals satisfied. And so consequently, because of that, although states are not people like you and I, they have, in a way, a kind of mindset, right? They have things they want to accomplish. We can almost say that perhaps like human beings, they have egos, and their egos are satisfied when they are taking their will, the collective will of the people, and investing it to goals that are meeting their tastes, and they get terribly insulted when their ability to see those goals satisfied is frustrated. So in a way then, what we're suggesting is nation states, like people, act as one. They're corporate actors. That's the key term. They're corporate actors. They act as one body. And that it's fair to sort of say that even though there are a multiplicity of people there, because they act as one, that they are survivors. Survival, as we say, is a priority for the nation state, because basically all other public goods within that community depend on it. Even a dictator has to be aware of the needs of his people. He has to be aware of the need to preserve them, to keep them alive, maybe even to keep them happy to a certain extent. We have terribly negative views of dictators, and rightly so. But even dictators can't trot all over their people forever, as Machiavelli, the famous philosopher of international relations, once remarked. So we have to contend with that reality, that's what nation states are trying to accomplish. Even the most dictatorial nation state will need people, will need hardworking people, and hardworking people are usually healthy and happy. So it's something to think about. You can't just trot over everyone. This survival point, though, is not just about happiness and abundance, or however you want to frame it. It's not just about the survival of the public good of the community. It's about the fact that those goals, those tastes that the nation state is trying to satisfy, must also contend with the fact that the means of survival, the means of serving those goods, are all bound up in the endurance and the longevity of the nation state. And so we end up having to sort of identify two different levels of goal making for nation states. One of those goals, of course, is survival in the military sense, and the other goal then, as we've just been saying, is the survival in the sense of the happiness and the prosperity, if you will, of the community. But sometimes, historically, not all of those goals can be pursued at the same time. And so my final point here is that when it comes to survival, military affairs will always trump any other set of goals that the nation state or the population may have. So, for example, if our survival is on the line, we will sacrifice our economic prosperity before we will sacrifice our actual existence, right? And that's important for us to think about. It means that nation states are likely to make severe sacrifices in terms of their welfare, their happiness, in order to achieve military security. Hence, I suppose you can say a lot of nation states in the world today are anxiously trying to develop, for example, nuclear weapons. Why? Because those are the ultimate, although they're very expensive to develop, they are the ultimate technology, militarily speaking, that assures your survival, because once you have a nuclear weapon, nobody's going to come near you. Conversely, we can also say that nation states are generally not suicidal. That is to say, they know that were they ever to act militarily in such a way that would provoke the other countries around them to a great degree, that they could expect retaliation. They could expect to be hemmed in or balanced out in terms of their activity. So nation states are very savvy about that as well. And so they will want to make a priority of their military readiness for defending themselves against aggression. But similarly, they will not take that military readiness to such a point generally where they will start to alienate their neighbors. And so there is this careful calculation that goes on in relation to survival, and I just wanted you to be aware of that. So basically, the point here, to summarize it, is that states are kind of like human beings in some ways. They do have personalities, they have egos, because internally they have tastes and they have desires. Every nation state is like that. Even if those tastes and desires are more the tastes and desires of the dictator that might be dominating them than the population, if it's not a democracy, there still are ways in which the dictator has to be sensitive to the needs of that population if he is to be a successful dictator. So we can say that states do act as one. They are a multitude of people acting as one, and then we also have to figure out then, once we see that acting as one, or that corporate actorness, as we can say, that certain types of priorities will rise to the top, and generally those are the priorities of military survival, because all other goods, all other tastes and desires depend on military survival in the long run. And interestingly, that raises the question, for example, of how people think about countries like Iran today. If you notice that in American debates, in American foreign policy debates, sometimes people say Iran can never have a nuclear weapon because Iran is a crazy country. Well, what does it mean to be a crazy country? Historically speaking, it's very hard to identify crazy countries. They're not very common. In fact, some might say they're altogether rare. Most countries have goals and understand that in order to have a chance of achieving those goals, they need to be secure from a military point of view. So Iran is hardly the kind of country that would pursue its military readiness, as we were saying, to the point of alienating the other countries around it. Iran developing and then using a nuclear weapon would be very dramatic move, of course. It would be very disturbing for us. But our question really is, depending on our realist perspective here, or coming at it from a realist perspective here, how likely is Iran to use a nuclear weapon, given the reality that the neighboring countries would find it very alienating and would surely retaliate, as some American foreign policy analysts have said. The one thing Iran could be sure of, were to use a nuclear bomb, would be that it would be turned into a parking lot the next day, because every country on earth would probably, a good number of them, would unify together to balance out Iran's power and bring its military potential to an end. So would a country like Iran, which has goals, it has a spiritual set of goals, it has a politics, would it want to commit suicide? Would it want to end its possibility of ever achieving or satisfying those goals in the long run? The military there, in that case, is not there to be it's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. The military is a means to an end. So those other goals, those aesthetic goals, are very, very important. Which leads us to the third S, which is self-help. And to understand self-help, now that we've suggested that the nation state, our first S, is the main actor, and its basic goal is the second S, survival, how can this be achieved? The third S is self-help. And the key problem that pertains here in relation to this third S, self-help, is anarchy. So what is anarchy? Anarchy is the absence of law. If you break down the ancient word anarchos, to its constituent elements, it means without law. So if we think about it for a second, you and I live within a nation state, and within this nation state there is a court system, there's a judiciary, and through this judiciary, this neutral institution, we can have our disputes with each other mediated. So say I violate a contract with you, I violate a promise I've kept, I've said that I would keep with you, but I didn't keep my promise, and you're short now of the money or whatever resources you invested in the contract to help us in our mutual goals. What standing do you have in the courts? You could take me to court and prosecute me in the courts to get you your money back, and that's what it allows us to resolve our disputes peacefully here in this domestic situation. When I say domestic, I mean within the confines of a nation state. So domestically then, we can say we have a court system, we have institutions, and therefore there is no anarchy. There is a government over us that can help us regulate and mediate our disputes. But in anarchy, there is no government, right? There is no law. And so we look at the world today, and some people, conspiracy theorists, say there's a secret world government, but in fact, I think that's very, very, very unlikely. And certainly from a realist perspective, it's absolutely unlikely, because there's no equivalent of an actual government. We have the United Nations, we have other international institutions, but they are not a global government in any sense. So there's no real police force that's policing the relations between the nation states of the planet. The UN isn't really able to deploy anything like a police force. So there's no sovereignty at the international level, is what we're saying. There's no monopoly over the legitimate use of force at the international level. So if there's no law, internationally speaking, if there's no police force, internationally speaking, if there's no sovereignty, internationally speaking, then we are without law. And nation states have, therefore, unlike you and I, no recourse to the courts if they are to mediate their disputes. So what happens then? You kind of have what they call the law of the jungle, or schoolyard law, wherein basically the powerful are able to do what they want and the weak must do whatever they can in order to accommodate themselves to this fact. The basic goal then, if you want to survive, if you want to achieve your goal of survival, excuse me, is to pursue power at all times. And we call this pursuit of power self-help. But there's a dilemma when it comes to self-help, and that is that if everyone helps themselves, if everyone is helping themselves from the limited sort of, if you will, if you want to use the pie metaphor, if we're all digging away at the pie, then if I'm taking more of the pie than you are, there's less of the pie for you, and there's nowhere that you can get anymore. So for this reason that we say, this is the reason that we say that in anarchy, life is a zero-sum game. Now, I don't know how many of you will be old enough to remember the first campaign that Barack Obama fought for election against John McCain. John McCain, in the presidential debates, constantly used the pie metaphor. And he was suggesting that in capitalism, in the free market system, life is not a zero-sum game, that we can, and I'm using his exact words here, grow the pie. Now think about that for a minute. If you can grow the pie, that means that even though I might be taking a bigger piece than you, next year, because our pie is growing, the piece that you had is still going to be bigger than the piece you have this year. And my piece, of course, even though I'm taking a bigger piece than you this year, and next year it will be bigger still, and still bigger than your piece, it doesn't matter for you so much because you're more focused on the fact that your piece of the pie is growing. So that's a lovely idea. That's what we call a positive sum game, where everyone's winning, even though some are winning more than others. Everyone's winning a bit because the pie is growing. But in international relations, because of anarchy, because of the lack of government, because of the inability of you and I to resolve our disputes, there's only so much security going around. The pie of security is only so big, and it doesn't grow in that sense. The relative gains of my neighbor are troubling for me, right? I'm focused on how his power is growing relative to my power, and even if our power is growing at the same rate year after year, so long as you have more power than me, you're a threat, and if you have more power than me, you can eliminate me. So for this reason, then, we say that in international relations, because of anarchy, because of the self-help dilemma that everyone's helping themselves, and if you will, in what we call an arms race, we have this tendency towards a zero-sum game. My security is your insecurity, and vice versa. So two types of basic behavior emerge by consequence here. One is that nation states are always trying to develop new weapons, trying to increase the amount of security they can create from the resources they have at their disposal. And the other thing then is the forming of alliances. Small powers, even though they might not like each other very much, they have a tendency to want to form alliances. And one of the classic examples here, of course, here is the story of the Spartan alliance fighting the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the lecture. So I'm going to bring the lecture to a halt here, and we'll start again on this slide in part 2 of the lecture. So this is the end of part 1. I will see you in just a moment in part 2.